After 14 episodes, I've reached the last final milestone of this build, and that is to install a safety power switch. I've purchased this start-stop NVR switch button that will control the power of this double power point that the router and vacuum cleaner will be connected to. When the red button is pushed in to stop the electricity, it remains locked closed until you slide it up to access the on button. I'll supply power to all of this using this connector that allows me to connect an extension power cord when required. I'm going to mount the NVR switch at the front left of the router table, as this is the same location for my table saw's NVR. I'm going to mount the switch onto this piece of pine on the front of the leg. I'll be able to create a cavity for it to rest in, and that will make it easy to access when using the router table. On the left side of the table is where I plan to mount the input power plug and double power point. I'll need to make up some sort of mount for these, as I don't want to make changes to the table frame. I'm going to start off with the NVR switch mounting block, running the piece of pine I have through the thicknesser to clean it up and make it square, followed by a couple of cuts on the table saw to make it the width I require. I select the best piece of this length for the button and mark where the top will be. Using the button, I determine how long I want the mount to be, and I want to put a 45-degree bevel edge at the bottom to give it some sort of aesthetic style. Now before I go and cut this to size, I'm first going to make the cavity for the switch, as it'll be easier to do with a larger piece of wood. So I mark out where the cavity needs to go, and then mark out where I will be drilling holes with this 19mm spade bit. Over to the drill press, and before you know it, I've got 6 holes bored and things are starting to take shape. I'll follow this up with a bunch of chiseling to clean out the remainder of the waste, and finally the switch seems to fit in nicely. With this done, now I can cut it down to size. So over to the table saw miter sled and I square the top of the mount off. I then use my miter gauge to cut the bevel at 45 degrees for the bottom of the mount. With the switch in place, you can get an idea of what it would look like. However, I've decided to make some grooves at the top for the power cables. I need to do it this way, as I need to leave some meat in the wood for the top screw of the switch. Talking of screws, I find 2 specimens in my screw box that are exactly what I need to hold it in place. I use the drill press to create the pilot holes for these screws into the mounting block, as I want these to be nice and straight. 2 shakes of a lamb's tail later and the switch looks great in the mounting block. It's held there nice and solid, and there's plenty of room for the cables. I'll take it out now, as I've still got to mount it to the table and it's just going to get in the way. I start off by taping the mount to the table leg. This lets me determine where I want to drill the holes in the leg for the screws to come through from the back. It's easier for me to drill them from the front, so off it comes, and then I do just that. With the 2 screws in place, I tape the mount back onto the leg and press the screws into the mount so I know where to drill the pilot holes into the mount. With the mount removed again to the side, I can push the screw all the way through and mark the depth the pilot hole needs to be. With the drill bit set to that depth, I make the 2 pilot holes and then decide that I want a 3rd screw, so I go ahead and repeat the same process as above, and before too long I've got the switch mount screwed into the table leg and it's looking pretty nice at this stage. Now I need to bore a hole through the table leg for the power cords to pass through, as there will be the incoming mains power and then the power leading to the double power point. So using a spade bit, I work my way through the leg and I'm left with a nice hole that allows the cable to pass through with plenty of room. Next up, I need to work out how I'm going to mount the input plug and double power point. I have a piece of pine left over from when I made the feather boards, so I think I'm going to use this, as it can be mounted to the top leg support and the 30-degree angle cut kind of adds some style. I square it off first and then work out where the input plug and power point will be mounted so I know where to remove the waste. It's off to the drill press to use my spade bit to bore holes in the 4 corners of the power point, and then I use my coping saw to cut the remainder of the hole. With that done, I'm back to the drill press to use a hole saw to cut the opening for the input plug. I don't have a hole saw bit big enough, but it's removed the bulk of the waste. That's easy to fix though, as I've got my spindle sander I can use to widen this hole, and it doesn't take long at all. I'll also tidy up the power point hole while I'm here, switching to the smaller spindle to make those corners nice. Time for some sanding first, and then it's on to making the pilot holes for the input plug and the power point. I start off with the input plug first, making sure it's horizontally aligned, and then drill its pilot holes. Once it's back in, I pop the screws in and it's looking good. With the power point, I mark the location of the first hole, drill it and then screw it in place first before doing the same on the other side. This way it's nicely aligned, as you can see here. The screws that come with the power point are a bit long, so out with the hacksaw to trim them down and then a quick file to smooth them out. Back to the router table to see how it's looking so far, and I'm pretty happy. On the back side, I'm going to enclose it so the wires are not exposed to the dust and to prevent them from being accidentally snagged. I'm going to use the other piece of the pine I milled earlier for this and create a cavity in it so the wires can easily fit. I tape this piece to my front piece, mark out the circle location and then the center of the hole so I can then drill this out using the hole saw. With such a large piece of wood, I need to drill from both sides as my hole saw bit isn't deep enough. Over to the spindle sander to make the hole big enough for the input plug, and then once that's finished I tape the two pieces back together. I mark out the waste that needs to be removed from the end and also the cavity behind the power point. I then take the piece over to the table to mark out where the input power will be coming in. I can now separate the pieces, and from here I can mark out where I need to cut away the waste. The input plug cable needs to be routed to this cavity so it can be passed through to the NVR switch, so I mark out where I need to make this cavity as well. I drill a series of holes along this cavity first and then chisel out the remaining waste. It's not pretty, but I'll never see it, so it doesn't matter. For the larger cavity, I'll bore some holes in the corners using a spade bit, and then I'll use my hand saw to cut the width of the cavity. At this point, I decide that it's best to drill the hole that connects to the hole on the leg, as this is off-center to the table saw line I just made, and then finish up with sawing the other side of the cavity. With that done, I go to town with my big chisel and remove all of the waste in the cavity, making sure the input hole is wide enough to allow the cables to pass through. One last step is to remove that waste piece on the end, so I use my hand saw while the two pieces are clamped together. These two pieces will be joined using screws that will be mounted from the front. It'll make it easier to assemble when mounted to the table. So while they are clamped together, I drill some pilot holes at one end and then pull them apart so I can drill the holes out on the front piece along with countersinking them. I then repeat the same process for two more holes before reassembling it ready to be mounted. Back at the table, I clamp it to the upper frame and then mark out on the top edge where I want the screw holes to be located. I then unclamp it and drill the 3 screw holes and countersink them from the back. With it then clamped back in place, I can then poke the screws through and mark out the pilot holes in the front piece and then unclamp it again to drill the pilot holes. With all of that done, I can now screw it in place. Not only does it look good, but it also feels sturdy. I also checked the cables that will run to the NVR switch, and you can see there's plenty of room for them to come through. The last major step before I wire it all up is to give the pieces a couple of coats of satin varnish, giving them a light sanding after the first coat and then 3 more coats over the next couple of days. With all of that done, it's time to wire it up and assemble everything. First up is the mount for the NVR switch, and then the front mounting plate for the input plug and double power point. I set the switch in loose so I know how long the cable needs to be and then mount the input plug. With that done, I properly mount the NVR switch with both the input and output power cables and screw it in place. I then mount the back cavity, followed by wiring up the input plug and then the double power point. I pop on the front skin and it looks pretty slick. So does it work? Well, let's test it out on a light. Making sure the stop button is pressed in, I connect the input power first and then this extension cord which runs to a light on my workbench. I turn the power point on and then release the NVR switch, press the on button and hey presto, it works! When I pressed the big red button on the NVR switch, it powered off, so it's working perfectly. Another feature of the NVR is it cannot enter the on state without it being connected to input power, and when input power is removed, it automatically enters the off state. Anyways, enough testing, let's see it in action. First up, I need to drop the router into the insert and then connect it to the power point and turn it on at both the power point and then the router itself. Then I connect the vacuum and power it on. Finally, I can connect the input power, and when I release the NVR switch and turn it on, I get instant power. And when I'm finished, I just press it to power off. I'm very happy how this has turned out, and it makes using the router table much safer. And that, folks, is the end of my building a router table journey. Now I can use it to actually make things. I honestly didn't think it would span 15 episodes. However, there was a lot more to it, even with full build instructions to follow. I hope you've enjoyed coming along for the ride, and let me know your thoughts on the entire build. Wherever you are and whatever you're doing, I hope life is treating you well. Until next time, bye!